old days, maybe 20 years ago, people thought that SAARC, SAFTA, the SAARC visa regime, all kinds of exchanges between the countries, the South Asian University, for example, would actually lead to a situation where more borders would become like the India-Nepal one, given the historical links India has with each of these countries. In fact, it's become more difficult, and India is no longer a hub for any South Asian country trying to move to another. So you're no longer seeing India with that centrist position simply because of the people-to-people movement being restricted. Of course, the India-Pakistan relationship is right in the middle of it. Why do you think, in a sense, and do you think that this is a reversible trend, that while we do see a lot of infrastructural collaborations in South Asian countries, we don't see that sense of needs of people-to-people relations?
Well, thank you, Suhasini. And yeah, it's delightful to be here. I think the bedrock of our relationship in the neighborhood is really the people-to-people connect. And as you have said, I think the objective of SAARC eventually was that it'd be much more integrated region at every level, whether in terms of connectivity, road, railways, waterways, digital, but people to people above all. At least in the context of Nepal and Bhutan, where we have open borders, I think we have done reasonably well. I mean, there are problems on the borders from time to time. And, in Nepal, I hear a lot of voices that keep saying that, the open border is liable to misuse. And if newspapers are to be believed in Nepal, that, one of the recommendations of the EPG was to have some sort of smart controls on the border, etc. But, I fundamentally feel that open borders and more people-to-people contact is what is required. And that is really the ultimate goal of what we are talking about in terms of regional integration. Whether this is declining, and whether this trend is reversible. I mean, in the case of Nepal, at least, I don't think it's declining at all. In fact, it's very easy movement. And now with this digital financial connectivity, I'm told from December it's going to start.
UPI.
So whatever problems you have in terms of availability of Indian rupee resources, etc., will disappear. So I personally feel that, we're going to be more connected, more integrated. Secondly, India has been the fulcrum. So most of our neighboring countries really have a relationship with India, and perhaps through India with some of the other countries, which is a good thing. But if our neighboring countries have independent relations with each other, I think that's a plus. So it's a relationship with India, it's a relationship with the others. So if you have direct flight connections between various neighboring countries and, India and the neighboring, it's a plus. I don't think we should look at it as in some way reducing the, sort of significance or the importance of India in the region. I don't look at it like that. I think the more connectivity, in whichever way possible, will build and, further consolidate this region. And, our subject is the politics of cooperation. I just want to say one word on that. Everything is linked to politics. Development partnership, infrastructure development, hydropower cooperation, you cannot divorce it from the politics of the day, which is maybe domestic, bilateral, or regional. So I think that is something that all of us have to understand. There is no development partnership without politics.
All right. And I do want to come back to that, because not all that politics has played out for the best, as we heard in the last session. But I'd like to come to you, Mr. Chandra Bhatta. And of course, we read you in New Delhi and have seen your perspective on this. How do you respond, firstly, to Namrata's question on the people-to-people?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very interesting question, but it's a very old question as well. I think we slightly will have to change the perspectives, the way we look at the regional cooperations. The very idea of regional cooperation has been changing a lot in the last couple of years. And there are more than one region. I won't say only the regional cooperation, but the session is on neighborhood. So the idea of neighborhood is changing. So the people-to-people connection will have to be looked at slightly from a different perspective. First, where are the people meeting today? Which people are we talking about? Do we see connection? Yesterday, somebody was talking about Kashi and Kathmandu. Do we see that connection? I don't see that connection anymore happening. It's all about Banaras and Boston, Kathmandu and Kentucky. So there, there, it's these places where people are meeting. Of course, why people-to-people relations, why regional cooperation is not really working out? There are certain fundamental reasons behind that, which we have never really tried to look into. First, SARC itself was an artificial creation. That's my perspective. It was created by the states who were not really that powerful. Say the Bangladesh became an independent in 1972, but the Bangladesh and Nepal were the two countries who were pushing for the SARC. Is it really possible? I don't really think. There is we have to look at the whole politics of the regional cooperation, how the idea of regional cooperation came into being. For a few years, I think India was comfortable to be the part of, which is still the SARC member. But after that, I don't think there is strong reservations from the part of India, primarily because the current establishment, yes, at least does not really want to confine its identity within the SARC. The big country, the India as a power, India really wanted to be a big power, the global power. If you become a member of a SARC, it's a global, the Bharat or that identity India is looking for is going to be compromised within that the framework of the SARC. That's the first factor. The second factor is with the rise of new powers. They are creating their own type of regional cooperation, regionalism, like China, like India. Wherever you are comfortable with, you're creating your own regional cooperation. It's not only in this part of the world, but this has been happening in the other part of the world as well. So I think we'll have to look all these things from a slightly different perspective. The second thing, I think with South Asian countries are too much of, we talk about a regional cooperation. At the same time, we're also talking about too much of a nationalism and sovereignty. If you really wanted to have a functioning regional cooperation, you need to surrender certain level of sovereignty. That's the very, otherwise you cannot really have the regional cooperation, functioning. Look at the European Union. How has it succeeded? It has succeeded primarily because the European Union states were ready to compromise on their sovereignty, but some of the countries were not really comfortable with that. They were somehow fascinated by their empire, imperial power empire, and Britain, they came out of it. So every country, like, people are looking for their own identity today. Exactly in the same fashion, countries are also looking for their own identity. This is really having a great deal of impact on the structures that we have created in the last 20 or 30 years ago. I think this is going to have a great deal of impact on the regional cooperation or regional many things that are happening in the region. The second thing, the connectivity, the people-to-people country. As I said earlier, it is changing primarily because South Asia, if you look at the 1/4 of the population lives in this continent. But if you look at the capital formation process, that's not really happening. That's why a lot of people are forced to leave the region, and they are living outside of the region, and they interact there. They don't necessarily interact in this part of the region. So what is the problem? How do we then resolve this problem? Perhaps the way we look at the region, we've been using the word elite lot of times. The way elite look at the politics or the regional cooperation or international relations for that matter will have to be reversed. So if we really wanted to have a people-to-people contact, somehow we need to be able to deliver that can be useful for the people. Then we can, I think we can, build up the people-to-people contact. Otherwise, I think a lot of connectivity has been, a lot of infrastructure that can enable the connectivity in the region. It's moving ahead. But if you look at as I said, the people, they're not really, in the region. They're outside the region. In India-Nepal relations, I think I look at from slightly from a different perspective. Nepal's relations with India is largely civilizational. It's based on the civilizational relations. I normally use the 5G: Ganga, Gaya, Gayatri, Gotra, and Gai. And we still, there are people who still believe in these types of values in this country and the India as well, at the people's level. But if you look at the state, both the states are secular state. Then these people value does not necessarily make any sense for these countries. So I think we'll have to look at
Absolutely.
all
And,
these
you know,
things,
the point you make about a cultural or religious commonality doesn't always translate. I mean, you look at West Asia, for example, they don't only have one religion, they more or less have one language. And even so, they've had their own differences and a lot of tensions between these countries. If I could ask you, and then I'll take the same question to Ambassador Rai. Obviously, the politics of cooperation has been held up, if you look in the South Asia context, by the India-Pakistan equation. And given that India and Pakistan have had no talks at a certain level for 9 years, the South Asian idea also has gone away for these 9 years. There's sub-regional cooperation that is, as you pointed out, taking over. But another point of inflection, if you like, on the politics of cooperation came about after what happened between India and Nepal. And I'm referring to what Indians call the blockage and what Nepal refers to as the blockade. Do you think that has had a lasting impression on the idea of cooperation?
I think there is. I do not deny the fact that there is no cooperation in the region. There are countries are cooperating with each other, but there is also fear within the countries. If you look at each country, each South Asian country, fear from the other. It's Nepal, India, we're very close. We consider ourselves as a very close countries. We share many things, but there is some level of mistrust as well. This side and as well as the other side. You can see the same level of cooperation between other countries as well. So, if you look at the trade volume, I just look at from that angle. South Asian countries, if you look at, they don't really trade, the level of trade between these countries is not really encouraging. They are really interacting with outside of South Asia. Like, of course, some of the, economically not so powerful countries, they have always been getting benefited from the generosity of the economically powerful countries like India. But at the same time, economics alone is not that important, I would say. For a country like Nepal, we are a small state, not really that small. If you look at the size and the population, it's a middle-sized country. But the emotions of the country becomes quite important for us. So if anything happens, like people are quite agitating and they take it so seriously. If you look at in 2014 when Narendra Modi came to Kathmandu, everybody came out in the street because there was no visit from the Indian side for a long period of time. At the same time, right after the blockade or blockage, whatever you call it, there was a blockade. Then after that, anti-India sentiment just skyrocketed, I would say. So the countries like Nepal, the smaller countries, their strength lies on the people's sentiment. Somehow the powerful or the bigger, larger countries will have to take all these things into consideration. Then only the economic cooperations and other types of cooperation will take some sort of sense. Look at the Nepal has been receiving a lot of cooperation from the Western countries for nearly 70-75 years. But Nepal does not necessarily have a same level of sympathy or for these countries as well. You receive different types, a lot of things happen. So cooperation along with the self-respect of that country and the people will be much helpful to move the neighborly relations in a more sustainable way, I would say. Yeah.
All right, important points over there that you've made. Ambassador Rai, I should compliment you on your book because given that you are a diplomat, it was an extremely honest version of events during that time. As he said, the highs of Prime Minister Modi's first visit, the lows of what is commonly seen as the blockade. Do you think India, in a sense, took a misstep there? And do you think that India-Nepal relations can ever really recover from the memory of what can go wrong?
I'm a little skeptical about the fact that perhaps people-to-people relations are not as great as they were. I think they're absolutely wonderful, excellent relations. You can get different perspectives from where you're seated. In Kathmandu, you might get a different perspective. You go to the neighboring regions, you go to the far west of the country, or you go to the Tarai. So I don't think there has been any interruption in any way in terms of the people-to-people connect. And I want to make a distinction between the government-to-government relationship and the people-to-people relationship. So the government-to-government relationship may suffer from infirmities from time to time. But as far as I can see, the people-to-people relationship is extremely robust. And this is not just in the case of Nepal and India, but all our other 2015. Second point I also wanted to say is that, the way I look at it, regional cooperation is critical. It doesn't matter so much to me which institution you use, but the idea of regional cooperation is critical. And I think that's the way we're moving. So wherever, whichever country you can cooperate in the region, whichever group you can cooperate with, you should encourage it and go forward. And I think that seems to be, it's a logical and a valid strategy. So you leave your political issues aside with India and Pakistan. But at least with the other countries where you don't have these kinds of problems, you move ahead. And that's happening in terms of all the infrastructure connectivity. And that is going to strengthen people-to-people connect, especially with the UPI type of financial connectivity. On 2015, you have to, I've tried to explain this in my book. You have to look at how Indian policy evolved, how the situation in Nepal evolved. Where is the 2015 constitution coming from? There's a huge backstory to this. The 2015 constitution was supposed to be the culmination of the agreements reached that ended the Maoist insurgency and the Madhesi Andolans and agitations. And many of these agreements were enshrined in the interim constitution that was adopted. The problems arose because certain people felt that the commitments that were there in the interim constitution were rolled back. And so groups that were in favor of these changes started protesting and agitating. And I think the view that India took throughout that period was that, look, this is a political issue. You have to talk to those that are feeling disenchanted. And that is the only way that you'll be able to resolve what we used to refer to as interruption in supplies. And, there was a bit of to and fro between the governments because people were sitting on the no man's land. Then who is to remove, the government here felt that we should do it. And we said, look, why should we do it? It's a political issue. You resolve the politics of the problem and it'll get sorted out. And it's not something that happened after the constitution. In the run-up to the constitution, those of you who are here will know about the kind of agitations and protests, and including a lot of people died. So it's not something that happened overnight. It's something that I think could have been forecast. So the line that we took was that it's a political problem. You resolve the political problem. Other things will get sorted out. What you might say is that, could India have used its influence? Why didn't India use its influence? So there I want to tell you, India in some sense or the other, I don't want to use the word guarantor, but was like a facilitator to both the Maoist agreement and the Madhesi agreement. And many of the leaders told us that we expect that these agreements that you have sort of been linked to will be implemented in full. Otherwise, why would we accept you? You're letting us down. So that is the other backstory. So, there's a lot of context. You can't just look at one event and say that, this is what happened and these are the implications. There's a huge backstory to why things developed the way they did. Would we have done things differently? It's very difficult to say. At that time, our assessment was that this is the right policy that we are following. Implications of that policy could have been foreseen perhaps, and perhaps they weren't. Anyway, policy is a dynamic thing. It changes according to the circumstances. And it did thereafter.
And certainly, as you said, the politics of cooperation between the two countries has, at least as evinced by the last visit of the Prime Minister from here, seems to suggest that there is now a working relationship that has kind of recovered a lot of the misgivings, if you like, of 2015. Could I ask you then how Nepal sees the new kind of development? Prime Minister Modi referred to it as the hit of India-Nepal ties, highways, highways, and transmission lines. Even there, of course, there are issues. And as Ambassador Rai pointed out, there's always going to be some politics when it comes to regional cooperation. It's not just India-Pakistan. After all, when we talked about the BBI and motor vehicles agreement, Bhutan decided to stay out. When we talk about other issues, we find other neighbors not as excited about the idea. In fact, when it comes to India-Sri Lanka road linkage, there are those in Sri Lanka who have an issue with it. Do you think that the idea of the hits is actually the way forward when it comes to India-Nepal as well?
It's a very interesting question. It depends entirely on the capacity of Nepal as well as India, I would say. Primarily because, as Ambassador said earlier, many things that happens in this, between Nepal and India is also the reflection of internal politics. So if anything goes bad in the domestic politics, that will have a consequences for the cooperation that we wanted to have with India or India wanted to have with Nepal for that reason. That's the most important factor. In fact, we really would not been able to manage this thing for a long period of time, and it's. I hope we could do it in the future. This second point, I would say, the most important one is the rise of the other actors in the region. I would say basically between the third party has come into the relations between Nepal and India. Always it's all about third party. How do we manage that party? So if we wanted to, of course, there has been some sort of genuine, the endeavor from the part of India, as well as there is a commitment from the part of Nepal that we should implement some of these projects that will not only consolidate or enhance the relation between these two countries, but will also benefit people at large. But yet again, the way things are happening, how do we manage the third factor? I would that means the new the multiple actors that have come into the in the region. The geopolitical factor, I would say, entirely the if anything that India wanted to do in Nepal or that Nepal seeks from India, there are internal political forces and there are external factors as well, and we are not really been able to manage it, and somehow Nepal's internal politics is also very much ideological, I would say. So that does not sometimes allow us to make a proper decision, but it again depends on how two countries take these projects ahead. That would be the most important part. But after our last couple of years, if you look at it's seemingly difficult not only for Nepal but for also India to have any project successfully moving ahead.
So certainly the success of these projects will decide. Ambassador Ray, I do want to ask you a question that I get asked a lot in Kathmandu, and that's the coolness factor. Mr. Bhatta referred to the idea that the conversations are not about Kathmandu, Delhi, as much as perhaps they are about Kathmandu, Kentucky. In Thimphu, I hear the idea that more young Bhutanese are now moving to Australia, to other countries other than India. We see it a lot in the region. In India, I can tell you when I speak to a college audience, I say, how many of you have traveled abroad? And a lot of hands go up. And then I say, how many of you have traveled in the region? And there are much fewer. So the region is not the first point for people to go. There's another question that many put, is why are our diplomats not as cool as some of the others? So we've had in Kathmandu, we've had an American diplomat, a Chinese diplomat. They speak the language. They are part of the music. They're part of the dance and the other parts of Kathmandu culture. Whereas Indian diplomats, sometimes, I'm not speaking about you, but are seen as much more, sort of regal in their bearing and a little bit of stodginess. If you like. Do you think Indian diplomacy also needs to up its game, if you like, in this cooperation?
Well, I guess this is the age of the social media and TikTok and so on. So, everyone has to change with the time. But I'm very happy that I didn't have to do, TikTok dance videos and stuff like that in my career. And may I ask you a question, Suhasini? because this is something that I've also written about in my book, and it's the role of the media. And, I think the media has such a critical role, both positive and negative. Positive in terms of awareness. I mean, you refer to the fact
you
that,
might say is that
perhaps more students now look for greener pastures outside South Asia. And it's true of Indians, Bhutanese, Nepalese. Everyone who can would prefer to go to Australia or the US. But that doesn't necessarily mean, it's also a question of how rich you are and so on. And so the richer people are obviously moving out to Australia. But there is another segment which continues to come into India. And as far as I know, at least some years ago, there were some 30,000 students from Nepal that were studying in India. And most of them were paying for themselves. Right. So I think there is this awareness factor, which is also very critical, where the media plays a role. Why is it that people, well-heeled people, you ask them and nobody's been to Nepal or Bhutan? They've all been to the US, Europe, everywhere. And why? So I think awareness, and this is media in general, whether it is our films or stories about our neighborhood. There's nobody from the Indian media based in Kathmandu. I think there's one stringer for the PTI. And on the negative side, for instance, when the earthquake happened, so such a lot of good work was being done, but the projection in India that everything was being done by the government of India, that the focus of the government of India was on evacuating the Indian citizens, whereas it's really the Nepalese people that were really suffering. And since most of the Indian television channels were seen in Nepal, there was a huge sense of resentment. And it took us some time to deal with this. So there's a lot of rumor mongering in terms of type of assistance coming in. The Indians have come, they'll never go back. That kind of stuff. So I don't know what can be done, but I think there really needs to be much more interaction between perhaps the media in the two countries.
I think that's absolutely true. And yet we're looking at a situation today where, as you said, there are less and less people actually going to each other's capitals than there were before. I will not absolve the Indian media of that role. I think it is for the Indian media to open the windows required so that people in each of our countries look at each other with a more honest lens. For what happened during the earthquake, there was a real disconnect between how the Indian media wanted to portray India's role and the sensitivities on the ground. And the truth is that this is not something that is normal Indian culture even. In fact, I'd written a piece at the time quoting from 3 different scriptures, which essentially say that your right hand should not know, if you are giving with your right hand, your left hand should not also know about it. If you are helping someone out tomorrow, they can help you. And the idea that this was some kind of an unequal relationship was unfortunately the outcome of what happened. These are lessons, I think, that have been learned. These have to be also lessons that have to be learned inside a government about the messaging it puts out. I think it began by the messaging, and excuse me for being very honest, that the Prime Minister put out, maybe inadvertently, when he said that I spoke to the Nepal Prime Minister and he wasn't in Nepal at the time. The idea that the Indian cabinet met before the Nepali cabinet met in dealing with the earthquake certainly sent a message of its own. But I think the large amount of awareness, if you like, can only come from the other problem that Namrata pointed out, which is if between our countries, visas are so difficult to get. I'm not talking about India and Nepal, of course, we can freely go between each other's countries. But if there isn't an idea of regional consensus today, people from the region often don't meet in the region. I have attended South Asia conferences in Dubai and said, what is the purpose of this South Asia conference in West Asia? And the answer always is, well, it's easier to connect. That even South Asian countries have such little connectivity in between each other that forget the visas, even if you get the visas, people would prefer to fly to a third country than to one of our own. I think these are all ideas that have to be internalized inside the government. The rejection of South Asia, the rejection of a kind of equal regionalism comes from within a government as much as it has to come out from outside. I think the idea should not wait. The gentleman from Sri Lanka has now left. But in the last year, both sides have given such incentive to travel between India and Sri Lanka. My question is, why did we wait for an economic crisis to do that? Why do we insist? Kanakji referred earlier to the problem that Nepal faces, and I think Prime Minister Pushpakamal Dahal actually referred to it in his bilateral comments with Prime Minister Modi, that we would like to see air services being given permissions through India. Why do we continuously allow the government to have such a strong role in people-to-people connectivity when all logic dictates that even if governments can't get on, the people definitely do? You can't put two South Asians in a room in any part of this world without them gravitating towards each other. And I say this from personal experience. But the moment you come back into our own countries, somehow the government seem to have put up invisible and actual very real walls between us that make it impossible to think about the region itself. I want to put a rider to this that I feel very privileged. In this month, I'm going to travel to Kathmandu, to Thimphu, to Dhaka, and to Colombo for different reasons. I hope that means that there is going to be some kind of and it's for different reasons, which means that there is more looking towards the region. There is also an international logic behind it. During COVID, one of the big sentiments that we saw around the world was an anti-globalization. That sentiment has been growing since the 2009, the collapse, if you like, the global collapse and the economic collapse. An anti-globalization where countries in the West are seeing less and less logic for globalization, and countries in the East are saying, well, or the South are saying, we haven't yet seen the benefits of it. The answer is not hyper-nationalism. The answer is not trying to grow your economy only from the inside. You do need an external stimulus. So where is every country looking? They're looking in their regions. The EU, minus Britain, has become more connected, if you ask me. Mercosur in South America has become stronger. USMCA does more trade than the US does with others. RCEP is looking at one kind of regional trade. The Gulf has its own GCC. Africa has its own continental free trade agreement. That actually leaves the South Asians out, because we don't have anything in between us that works. And every other region is working more and more within each other. So I definitely think that the media has a role in this. I definitely think that each of us has to speak up more, even if we are ridiculed in our own capitals. As we quite often are. But I think that the instruments of bringing people together, or at least of holding people back from meeting each other, still remain with the government. I'm being told that time is finishing, so I do want to give both of you a chance for just concluding remarks, and perhaps an answer to the question I asked Kanakji earlier as well. If regionalism and a greater understanding of border cooperation is to go forward, what are 2 or 3 things that you think one or the other government or both have to do in the future? I'll start with you, Mr. Bhatta.
I think if we really wanted to have regionalism move ahead, there are few things all countries will have to agree upon. First, the state formation process in South Asia is very, very problematic. This is creating a lot of tensions today as well. Somehow then, as I said earlier, countries should be willing to surrender some part of their sovereignty, I would say. That's the most important part. Of course, you have your own, you're a nation state, then territoriality, integrity, and all these things are important. But at the same time, if you really wanted to have a regional cooperation more vibrant, then that's how other countries have done. That's how the European Unions have done. That's why how ECOWAS is working. That you talked about, Mercosur is working exactly in the same way. That should be the most important part. The second point, if we really wanted to have a vibrant regional cooperation, we should be willing to create an economy within the region. See, we have a cooperation here, but economy is not here. People are always going outside. Then people with the cooperation or the regional body without people is not really going to work out. Third, a lot of bureaucracy is there in implementing the regional instrument. Somehow we also need to work on these factors. And the most important factor, we're talking about people people-to-people connections. How many, how many of the Indian universities have a cooperation with the universities in Nepal? As you said, you talk about the media connection between the media. Of course, you might meet media people they meet outside of the region, but I don't see that type of institutional cooperation happening in the region of late. A lot of universities of the region have a cooperation outside of the region. So we need to change all these things. Then only we can have a cooperation that we really wanted to have.
Certainly, a meeting of minds
Yeah.
needs much more. Ambassador Ray, you have the
You know,
last word.
I'm pretty bullish about our region, and I think a lot is happening. I mean, just look at hydropower. Look at the relationship between India and Nepal, and hopefully between India and Nepal, Bangladesh, and perhaps India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Bhutan. I mean, this is a game changer. And this is, it's really going to bring our entire region together, and perhaps Sri Lanka will also be connected to the Indian
I cut you
electricity.
just because he said, Mr. Bhatta said, you have to give up a bit of your sovereignty in order to forge real cooperation. When India refuses to allow power coming from Nepali hydropower plants that have had some kind of connection to a Chinese company, what is the answer to that?
So you look at it, you're looking at it either as a glass half full or a glass half empty. I think we've made an excellent beginning. And this doesn't mean that there's not work to be done. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done. And I want to come back to my earliest point that you can't divorce your development, partnership, and cooperation from the politics of the region, from the geopolitics. Whether we like it or not, that influences decision making. So I look at it as a glass half full. And I think we're moving forward. And so that's a great thing. And, if you said three things that we should do, for me, it's only one thing, and it's implementation. So whatever projects we are doing, and they have to be implemented well and speedily. So we just create the framework within which our private sectors, our people-to-people connect, it's facilitated. And that's all we need to do. I mean, we have industrious, entrepreneurial people. They go all over the world, do extremely well. There's no reason why we can't do well working together in our region. So I'm very optimistic. There are problems, but I think we've made a good start and we're moving in the right direction.
All right. To borrow from our neighbor that we often invoke, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So the idea that regional cooperation is starting with whatever steps it can, taking into account the kind of political realities each of our country faces, is perhaps one way forward. But I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this session, which has been a little unorthodox in terms of how we've managed it, but I think an enriching discussion has been had by all. So thank you very much.
So this was indeed very stimulating. Let's begin our next session, which is Scriptures and Society, Dr. Deb Roy's insight into Indian ethos and economy. Chandra Bhatta will be in conversation with Dr. Bibek Debaroy. So may we please have both of them on the stage? So let us have Chandra Bhatta and Dr. Bibek Debaroy on the stage, please. And let's welcome both of them with a round of applause, please.